Welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's story, I'd like to ask for your support. If you like documentaries, detective films, and true stories like this, please subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment. It may seem like a small thing, but it helps YouTube recommend these videos to more people and helps the channel grow. Thank you. Now, let's talk about Lars Mittank. 3 people were found dead inside a quiet family home in Chulliota, Florida. At first, the scene appeared to fit a familiar pattern. A son, 2 parents, a gun. Detectives had investigated suspected murder-suicides before. This initially appeared to be another one. But within hours, investigators began questioning that first impression. Not because of fingerprints, not because of DNA, and not because someone confessed. Instead, the investigation took an unexpected turn as detectives reconstructed the family's recent history, including its digital trail, bank records, online payments, private messages, and one name appearing again and again. It did not belong to a neighbor, a friend, or a relative. It belonged to a webcam performer living nearly 5,000 miles away, in Bulgaria. How could someone on the other side of the world become one of the central figures in a triple homicide investigation? To answer that question, investigators first had to understand the man who believed they were in a genuine relationship. Because this case did not begin on the night 3 people died. According to the evidence presented at trial, it had been unfolding for months. The home stood on a quiet street in Chulliota, Florida. Nothing about it suggested violence. Neighbors would later describe the Amato family as private and generally quiet. Inside the house lived Chad and Margaret Amato, their youngest son, Cody, and their older son, Grant. Another son, Jason, lived elsewhere but remained close to the family. From the outside, the house appeared unremarkable. There was no publicly known history of domestic violence. But inside the family, serious tensions had already begun to develop. According to evidence presented at trial, those tensions centered largely on Grant's online activities, his financial decisions, and growing conflict within the household. Appearances can be deceptive, especially when the most significant part of someone's life exists almost entirely online. Long before detectives arrived at the house, Grant Amato had become deeply involved in an online relationship that would later become a central focus of the investigation. One part of his life existed in Florida. The other was unfolding behind a computer screen. And according to the evidence presented at trial, those 2 worlds were moving toward a collision that would change everything. Before this case made national headlines, the Amato family appeared remarkably ordinary. Chad Amato had spent years working in healthcare. Margaret devoted much of her life to raising their children. Friends and relatives would later describe them as caring parents who genuinely wanted the best for their sons. The family owned their home. The brothers grew up together. They exercised together and shared many of the same interests. Like countless other families, they had disagreements from time to time. But to people outside the home, there were no obvious signs that violence was approaching. If someone had walked past that house a year earlier, there would have been nothing to remember. No police cars, no public disturbance, nothing that hinted at the tragedy to come. That ordinary appearance would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of the investigation, because according to the evidence presented at trial, while life inside the house appeared normal from the outside, serious problems had already begun developing behind closed doors. A story that few people fully understood. Not the neighbors, not most of their friends, and as the investigation would later reveal, not even every member of the Amato family. Grant Amato wasn't always the man investigators would later describe in court. For years, he appeared to be building an ordinary future. He studied nursing, worked in healthcare, and from the outside, his life seemed to be following a familiar path. But over time, that path began to change. According to testimony presented at trial, Grant struggled to keep his career on track after losing his job in healthcare. He became increasingly isolated and spent more and more of his time online. By itself, that was not unusual. Millions of people spend hours on the internet every day. But investigators later argued that for Grant, the online world had become more than entertainment. It had become an escape from disappointment, from failure, and from the life he believed he should have been living. Then, he discovered a website that would become the center of his attention. According to the evidence presented at trial, that decision would eventually reshape not only his future, but the future of his entire family. The website itself wasn't illegal. It wasn't hidden. And there was nothing inherently unusual about the woman who appeared on Grant's screen. She was an adult webcam performer from Bulgaria, known online as Sylvie. Like thousands of online creators, she interacted with viewers who paid for her time and attention. Most customers, those interactions ended when the session was over. According to the evidence presented at trial, for Grant, they did not. At some point, the boundary between a paid online interaction and what he believed was a genuine personal relationship appeared to disappear. Investigators later found evidence that Grant was not simply spending money. He believed he was building a future. He told people that Sylvie loved him. He claimed they were planning a life together. He spoke about her, not as an online performer, but as someone he believed would eventually be with him. Whether those beliefs reflected reality was an entirely different question. Nothing presented at trial indicated that Sylvie was involved in the murders, or that she knew what was about to happen. But to understand this case, investigators first had to understand something far more powerful than deception: belief. Because when someone becomes deeply invested in a version of reality, contradictory facts may become easier to ignore. And according to the evidence presented in this case, that growing disconnect from reality would become one of the investigation's most important themes. At first, the payments were relatively small, a few $100s, then a few thousand, nothing that immediately suggested a catastrophe. But investigators later reconstructed the financial records, and the numbers told a very different story. Over the following months, Grant transferred more than $200,000. According to prosecutors, much of that money did not belong to him. Approximately $60,000 was taken from his brother Cody. Additional family funds disappeared. Firearms were sold or removed, and investigators alleged that more than $150,000 ultimately came from family assets, including money borrowed against the family home. The deeper investigators looked, the more extraordinary the financial picture became. Grant was not living the life he presented online, yet according to the evidence, he portrayed himself as financially successful, someone who could easily afford expensive gifts. The image he projected online appeared increasingly disconnected from reality, and with every new payment, for months, Grant managed to hide how much money had disappeared. The payments were spread over time, large enough to cause enormous financial damage, but gradual enough that no single transaction revealed the full picture. Then, everything changed. The missing money could no longer be explained. Questions became accusations. Accusations led to evidence, and piece by piece, the family began discovering what had actually happened. Cash was gone. Savings had disappeared. Firearms had been sold or taken. Money had been borrowed against the family home, not to pay debts, not to start a business, not because of an unexpected emergency. According to the evidence presented at trial, the money had been flowing in one direction, to someone Grant had never met in person. Imagine trying to understand that as a parent. Your adult son is not hiding a drug addiction. He is not hiding a gambling problem. Instead, he is secretly sending away nearly everything the family can afford into someone living on another continent. According to testimony presented at trial, The discovery deeply shocked the family, yet they still believed Grant could be helped. They had not given up on him. Not yet. What they did not realize was that, according to the evidence presented at trial, Grant had become deeply committed to a version of reality from which admitting the truth may have felt impossible. Families often believe there is one conversation, one decision, one final chance that can change everything. The Amato family believed that too. After discovering the financial losses, they confronted Grant. According to testimony presented at trial, it was not a single emotional argument. It became an extended effort to interrupt a pattern that had gradually taken over his life. His mother searched for professional help. Grant entered a treatment program in Fort Lauderdale. For a brief time, it appeared the family might still be able to help him. But deeply rooted patterns of emotional attachment and compulsive behavior are rarely resolved overnight. According to testimony, even while receiving treatment, Grant continued looking for ways to reconnect with Sylvie. The family's concern continued to grow. According to witnesses, they even took turns keeping an eye on him. They were afraid he might leave or resume the behavior that had already caused so much damage. Looking back, that detail is especially heartbreaking. They believed they were trying to save their son. They could not have known that those would be the final days they would ever spend together as a family. By the end of January 2019, the situation inside the Amato home had reached a breaking point. Grant had already lost his job. The money was gone, and his family finally understood where it had gone and why. They gave him one final ultimatum. He had to end contact with Sylvie. The spending had to stop, and he could no longer remain in the house under the same conditions. From the family's perspective, this was not punishment. It was an attempt to stop the damage before there was nothing left to save. In psychology, major interventions often create what is sometimes called a crisis point, a moment when long-held beliefs, expectations, or emotional commitments collide with reality. People respond to those moments in different ways. Some accept the situation. Others resist it. According to prosecutors, Grant's situation had become about more than money. They argued that he was confronting the collapse of a future he genuinely believed was possible. If the money stopped, the relationship he believed in might also come to an end. And after months of extraordinary financial and emotional investment, accepting that possibility may have become increasingly difficult. What happened next would become the central question of a triple homicide investigation and forever change the Amato family. Investigators would later reconstruct what happened inside the house. According to the evidence presented at trial, on January 24, 2019, Grant Amato shot his father, his mother, and his younger brother, Cody. All three died from gunshot wounds. But the violence did not end with the killings. As detectives examined the house, they concluded that someone had attempted to stage the scene. Investigators believed the firearm had been positioned to suggest that Cody had killed his parents before taking his own life. At first glance, it was a scenario detectives had encountered before. Family murder-suicides do occur, but experienced investigators know something equally important. A staged scene is judged not by how convincing it appears, but by whether every piece of physical evidence tells the same story. That consistency was exactly what detectives began testing, and according to the investigation, the evidence did not support the scene as it appeared. The person responsible believed the scene would answer every question. Instead, it gave detectives entirely new ones. For experienced homicide detectives, a crime scene is more than a collection of evidence. It is a story. Every object, every position, every detail should be consistent with the same sequence of events. According to investigators, in the Amato home, they were not. The scene appeared to tell one story, but the physical evidence pointed investigators toward another. If Cody had truly killed his parents before taking his own life, why did key details fail to match that sequence? Investigators examined the position of the firearm, the location of each victim, the bloodstain evidence, and the timeline. Piece by piece, the original explanation became more difficult to reconcile with the evidence. This was not a dramatic breakthrough. It happened the way many real homicide investigations do. One inconsistency, then another, until detectives stopped asking, "Did this happen?" and started asking, "Who wanted us to believe it happened this way?" That question changed the investigation, because once detectives suspect a staged crime scene, they begin looking not only at what is present, but also at what is missing. The staged scene created doubt, but doubt alone does not solve a homicide. Detectives needed objective evidence, evidence that did not depend on memory, emotion, or opinion. So they turned to something that had been recording events all along: the digital trail. Bank records, phone records, internet activity, online conversations. Unlike human memory, digital records preserve a chronology. Every payment carries a timestamp. Every login leaves a record. Every transfer becomes another piece of the timeline. Investigators were not searching for one dramatic clue. They were reconstructing a life, minute by minute, day by day. And as that reconstruction grew, investigators concluded that Grant's account and the digital evidence could not both be accurate. The internet had helped build the story he presented to others. Now, according to the evidence, it was helping investigators dismantle it. And the most important discoveries were still waiting inside the data. By the time detectives sat down with Grant, they already knew something he didn't. The crime scene had raised serious questions. The financial records suggested a possible motive, and the digital evidence was beginning to contradict his account of what had happened. The interview was never simply about obtaining a confession. It was about testing a story. Experienced investigators rarely begin with accusations. Instead, they allow a suspect to explain. Because the longer someone speaks, the more opportunities investigators have to compare those statements with independently verified evidence. Grant denied responsibility. He continued pointing detectives toward the murder-suicide theory, toward Cody. But every explanation had to fit, not only the physical evidence, but the digital evidence as well. Digital evidence preserves chronology. Every payment has a timestamp. Every login leaves a record. Every transaction becomes part of the timeline. Detectives were not asking random questions. Many had already been compared against records sitting in front of them. To Grant, among the many witnesses, one testimony carried particular emotional weight: Jason Amato, Grant's older half-brother. He had not been living in the family home, but he knew both his family and Grant better than almost anyone. During the trial, Jason described how the financial deception had gradually torn the family apart. He spoke about the missing money, the broken trust, and the growing concern that Grant's online obsession had taken control of his life. His testimony supported the broader timeline presented by prosecutors. For the jury, this was no longer only a story told through bank records, digital evidence, or forensic analysis. It was also the story of a family that had tried repeatedly to help someone they loved. And despite everything that had happened, Jason's testimony reflected a painful truth. The people most affected by violent crime are often forced to testify against those they once trusted most. Because sometimes, justice requires telling the truth, even when that truth is about your own family. After weeks of testimony, hundreds of exhibits, and countless hours of argument, the case was finally in the hands of the jury. 12 people. No investigators, no lawyers, no detectives. Only the evidence. Their task was not to decide whether Grant Amato had made devastating financial decisions, or whether his online obsession had consumed his life. Their task was both simpler and far more difficult. Had the prosecution proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Grant Amato murdered his parents and his brother? On July 31, 2019, the jury returned to the courtroom. Its verdict was unanimous. Grant Amato was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. The verdict reflected months of investigation, thousands of pages of records, and a case built without a confession. For investigators, the verdict confirmed the conclusions they had reached after months of reconstructing the evidence. The attempt to stage the crime scene had failed, not because it appeared obviously unrealistic, but because it could not withstand careful comparison with the evidence. The physical evidence, the financial records, the digital timeline, the witness testimony. Together, they formed a version of events the jury concluded was proven beyond a reasonable doubt. But one important decision still remained. How would the court sentence Grant Amato for the murders of his family? In many murder cases, the verdict is the moment everyone remembers. In the Amato case, it marked the end of a months-long investigation and years of legal proceedings. The jury had unanimously found Grant Amato guilty of murdering his father, his mother, and his younger brother. The court then turned to sentencing. Under Florida law, the convictions carried mandatory sentences of life imprisonment. In August 2019, Grant Amato was sentenced to 3 consecutive terms of life in prison, without the possibility of parole. 1 sentence for each member of his family who had been killed. Legally, the case had reached its conclusion. The investigation was over. The trial was over. The appeals process would continue, but the jury's verdict remained unchanged. Yet the case continued to raise questions, not only about homicide, but about obsession, financial exploitation, online relationships, and how an ordinary family could be destroyed long before the first shot was fired. Cases like this often make headlines because of the violence. But violence was never the beginning of this story. It was the end. The story began much earlier, with isolation, with disappointment, and with the desire to become someone else, if only through a screen. Investigators found no evidence that Sylvie planned the murders, encouraged them, or knew they were about to happen. According to the evidence presented at trial, the relationship, as Grant understood it, became one of the central themes of the investigation. That distinction matters, because this case is not really about the internet, and it is not really about webcam platforms. It is about what can happen when a person's perception of reality gradually separates from the evidence around them, and they become increasingly unwilling to let go of the future they believe is possible. One decision leads to another. One lie requires a second. One payment leads to another. And over time, people may begin protecting the version of reality they have come to believe, rather than confronting the truth. When that version of reality is threatened, desperate decisions can sometimes follow. Nothing about that excuses what happened. Nothing ever could. But understanding how tragedies develop, step by step, decision by decision, may be one of the few ways we can hope to prevent the next one. Today, Grant Amato remains in a Florida state prison, serving 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The investigation is over. The trial is over. Appeals have continued, but the jury's verdict was based on the evidence presented in court. Most people remember this case because 3 members of one family lost their lives. Investigators remember it for something else: a crime scene they concluded had been staged, a digital trail that helped reconstruct what had happened, and a reminder that, in the modern world, our actions often leave records behind, even when no one believes they are being watched. Bank records, phone logs, messages, and search history. Unlike human memory, digital records preserve chronology. They do not become frightened, they do not forget, and they do not change because a story changes. By themselves, they rarely solve a case. But when combined with physical evidence, forensic analysis, and witness testimony, they can help reveal what really happened. Sometimes, the most compelling witness in a homicide investigation is not a single person, but the consistency of independent evidence. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary informative, please consider subscribing to the channel, and I'll see you in the next investigation. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your support really helps the channel grow and allows me to create more documentaries like this. And don't forget to click the notification bell so you won't miss future videos. If you'd like to watch more mysteries, disappearances, and true stories, be sure to check out the other videos on the channel. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.